I've always been the kind of man who notices the details. The way the light catches my wife's hair in the morning, the faint hum of our old refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under my boots. My name's Daniel, and for 15 years, I've built a life with Claire that felt like a steady, dependable rhythm. We live in a quiet suburb, a brick house with a tidy lawn, 2 cars in the driveway, and a dog named Rusty who greets me at the door every evening. Claire's a schoolteacher, soft-spoken and warm, with a laugh that used to make my chest ache in the best way. I'm a mechanic, hands rough from years of turning wrenches, but I've always been gentle with her. At least I thought that was enough. Started with the phone. Not mine, hers. One night, I was in the garage tinkering with an old carburetor, the kind of project that keeps my mind steady, when I realized I'd left my coffee mug inside. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped into the kitchen. Claire was upstairs, showering, I assumed, since I could hear the faint rush of water through the pipes. Her phone sat on the counter, buzzing like an angry hornet. I didn't mean to look. Honest to God, I didn't. But the screen lit up with a name I didn't know, Jay. Just Jay. No last name, no context. The message preview said, "Can't stop thinking about last night." My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing. People text strange things all the time. Maybe it was a friend, a coworker, someone from her book club. Claire didn't keep secrets. She wasn't the type. I poured my coffee, went back to the garage, and tried to focus on the carburetor. But that name, Jay, stuck in my head like a splinter. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd brushed off before. She'd take her phone into the bathroom with her. She'd smile at it in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. And once, when I asked who she was texting, she said, "Oh, just a parent from school," and changed the subject too fast. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I'm not a man who jumps to conclusions. I fix things. I figure them out. So I watched. I waited. And then, one Tuesday, she said she had a late meeting at school. "Grading papers," she told me, her voice light as she kissed my cheek and grabbed her keys. I nodded, said I'd heat up leftovers, and watched her drive off. But something gnawed at me, a hunch I couldn't shake. I got in my truck and followed her. She didn't go to the school. She drove across town to a diner I'd never heard of, a dingy little place with neon signs flickering in the windows. I parked a block away, my heart thudding against my ribs, and watched her step out of the car. She smoothed her dress, her favorite blue one, the one she used to wear for me, and walked inside. Through the window, I saw her slide into a booth across from a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a smug grin. Jay. I thought. It had to be him. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The diner's lights cast a sickly glow over the parking lot, and through the smudged glass, I could see Claire laughing. Laughing like she hadn't in years. Not with me, anyway. The man across from her leaned in, his hand brushing hers on the table, and she didn't pull away. My chest felt like it was caving in, but I didn't move. I needed to know. I needed to see how far this went. His name was Jonathan, I'd learn later. Jonathan Pierce. A real estate agent of all things. Some slick guy who sold overpriced condos to people with more money than sense. But right then, he was just a shape in the window, a shadow stealing something I'd thought was mine. They stayed in the diner for an hour, talking, smiling, sharing a slice of pie like it was some kind of private ritual. When they left, I ducked low in my seat as they walked to his car. A shiny black sedan that screamed money. She climbed in with him and they drove off. I followed, keeping my distance. My truck's engine rumbled too loud for stealth, but they didn't seem to notice. They pulled into a motel 10 minutes later, one of those cheap places with peeling paint and a flickering vacancy sign. My throat tightened as I watched them get out, his arm around her waist, her head tilted toward him like she belonged there. They disappeared into room 12, and the door clicked shut behind them. I sat there for 2 hours, staring at that door, my mind spinning through every memory I had of her. Our wedding day, her in that white dress, promising forever. The nights we'd spent planning a future, kids, a bigger house, maybe a trip to Italy someday. Had it all been a lie? Or had I missed something? Some crack in the foundation I'd been too blind to see? The lights in room 12 went out, and I drove home, my hands shaking so bad I nearly ran a red light. The next morning, Claire came home at 6 a.m., claiming she'd stayed late at school and crashed on a friend's couch. Her hair was mussed, her eyes bright in a way that didn't match the story. I nodded, poured her coffee, and said nothing. But I started planning. I wasn't going to let this slide, not out of pride, not out of anger, but because I needed to understand. I needed proof. I bought a tiny camera online, the kind you can hide in a smoke detector. I installed it in our bedroom while she was at work, feeling like a stranger in my own house. I tapped her phone, too, found an app that mirrored her texts to my laptop. It didn't take long to confirm it. Messages from Jay poured in. Last night was incredible. When can I see you again? You're my everything. She'd reply with hearts, with promises, with words she'd stopped saying to me years ago. The proof was a knife in my gut, but it wasn't enough to just know. I needed to see it, to feel the weight of her betrayal sink into my bones. So I kept watching. Claire and Jonathan had a routine: Tuesday nights at the diner, then the motel. Sometimes Fridays, too, if she could invent an excuse. I'd sit in my truck, a block away, watching them laugh and touch and disappear behind that door. Each time, it carved a little deeper, hollowing me out until I barely recognized the man in the mirror. Jonathan wasn't just some fling. The messages showed it was more. Plans to meet his parents, talk of a weekend away. She was building a life with him, piece by piece, while I was still fixing her car and mowing our lawn. I started digging into him. His real estate website had his face plastered everywhere. Sharp jaw, polished smile, the kind of guy who'd never known a hard day's work. He lived in a condo downtown, drove that black sedan, and had a reputation for charming clients. I found his social media, too, pictures of him at wine tastings, golf courses, places Claire had never cared about with me. One night, I followed him home from the motel instead of her. His condo was in a glass tower, all sleek lines and city lights. I parked across the street and watched him step out, whistling like he owned the world. He didn't know I existed. To him, I was just the guy whose wife he'd borrowed, a shadow he'd never have to face. That's when the idea hit me. Not just anger, but a cold, deliberate need to make him pay. To make them both pay. I started small. I knew cars, so I messed with his. A tiny puncture in his brake line, slow enough that he wouldn't notice until it was too late. I didn't want him gone. Not yet, just rattled. The next week, he posted online about a close call on the highway, blaming shoddy mechanics. I smiled at that, sitting in my garage with my tools spread out like old friends. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Claire didn't suspect a thing. She'd come home, kiss my cheek, and chatter about her day while I nodded and watched the lies spill out. The camera caught her texting him from our bed, her fingers flying over the screen while I slept beside her. I'd play the footage back later, alone, letting the bitterness settle in. She'd call him my heart. Tell him she couldn't wait to be free. Free of what? Me? The life I'd poured everything into? I needed more than sabotage. I needed something that would break them, something they'd never see coming. So I kept digging, kept watching, kept planning. Jonathan had a weakness. He loved his image, his perfect little world. And Claire? She loved the thrill, the escape. I'd take it all away, piece by piece, until they had nothing left to hold on to. The days blurred into a haze of routine and rage. I'd go to work, turn wrenches, smile at customers, then come home to a wife who didn't know I'd unraveled her secret. Claire started wearing perfume again. Not for me, but for him. She'd hum while cooking dinner, her mind somewhere else, and I'd sit across from her at the table, chewing silently, imagining the moment I'd pull the rug out from under them both. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was a man possessed, every thought bent on crafting something they'd never recover from. Jonathan's break scare hadn't slowed him down. He kept meeting her, kept grinning like he'd won some prize. So I upped the game. I knew his condo's parking garage from tailing him. Cameras were sparse, security lax. One night, I slipped in with a can of spray paint and a crowbar. I scratched liar across his sedan's hood, smashed a side mirror, and slashed 2 tires. Petty, sure, but it felt good to watch the air hiss out, to leave a mark he couldn't ignore. The next day, his social media erupted. Pictures of the damage, captions about jealous losers, and random vandalism. Claire texted him, "Who would do this?" He didn't know. She didn't either. But I did. At home, she started getting jumpy. She'd check her phone more, glance at me like she sensed something off. I played dumb. Asked about her day, offered to fix her lunch, kept the mask on tight. The camera caught her pacing one night, whispering into the phone, "I think we need to be careful." Jonathan's voice crackled back, "It's nothing, babe. Just some punk." She didn't sound convinced, but she didn't stop seeing him. That's when I knew. Petty stabs wouldn't cut deep enough. I had to hit them where it hurt most. I started with her school. Claire loved her job, teaching 3rd graders, shaping little minds. It was her pride, her identity. I found an old photo of her and Jonathan from his social media, one she didn't know he'd posted. They were at a bar, her arm around him, both of them laughing. I printed it, typed an anonymous letter claiming she was involved with a parent, and mailed it to her principal. I didn't care if it was true, just plausible enough to stir trouble. A week later, she came home pale, saying there'd been a complaint, a meeting with HR. "It's ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone's lying." I hugged her, told her it'd blow over, and hid my smirk in her hair. Jonathan's turn was next. His real estate gig thrived on trust, clients handing over life savings for a dream home. I created a fake email, posed as a disgruntled buyer, and sent a detailed complaint to his boss. Pierce took my deposit and ghosted me. Shady as hell. I attached a doctored screenshot of a bank transfer, just convincing enough. Then I posted it on review sites, spread it through fake accounts. His online rating tanked overnight, clients canceled, his phone buzzing with damage control. He texted Claire, frantic, "Someone's out to get me." She replied, "We'll figure it out together." Together. That word burned. By now, I was a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions, smiling at Claire while my mind churned with plans. She was unraveling, though she hid it well. The school put her on leave pending an investigation, and she'd spend hours on the couch, staring at nothing, muttering about fixing this mess. Jonathan wasn't faring better. His career was bleeding out, his perfect image cracking like cheap glass. I'd watch his posts dwindle, his confidence erode, and feel a quiet thrill. But it still wasn't enough. I wanted them broken, not just bruised. I dug deeper into Jonathan. Hired a guy, some shady type I found through a buddy at the shop, to tail him, dig up dirt. Took a week, but he delivered. Jonathan had a side hustle, selling client data to a shady marketing firm. Illegal, unethical, and perfect. I leaked it, anonymous tips to his company, a few key clients, even a local reporter. The story hit online fast. Local realtor caught in data scandal. His phone must have lit up like a Christmas tree. Claire's text to him turned desperate. "Is it true?" He swore it was lies, but the damage was done. His firm suspended him, and the condo he loved so much went up for sale. Claire started pulling away from me, too. Not physically, but I could feel it. She'd sit in silence, picking at her nails, lost in her own head. One night, she broke down, sobbing about the school, the rumors, how it wasn't fair. I held her, whispered it'd be okay, and hated how good it felt to lie. The camera caught her later, calling Jonathan. "I can't do this anymore. It's too much." He begged her to stay, promised they'd run off together. She hung up, and I knew the thread between them was fraying. That's when I decided to go bigger. I'd been patient, surgical, but now I wanted chaos. I remembered a story Claire once told me, her childhood fear of being watched, exposed. I used it. I hacked her email easy enough with the mirroring app and sent a mass message to her contacts. Family, friends, coworkers. Attached was a photo from the motel, one I'd snapped of her and Jonathan outside room 12. Blurry but unmistakable. The email read, "Thought you should know who she really is." I hit send, watched it spread, and waited. Her phone exploded the next morning. Calls, Texts, her mom crying, her sister furious. She screamed at me. "Did you do this?" I played dumb. Said I'd been hacked too. Even showed her a fake email I'd sent myself. She bought it, but the fallout was brutal. Her world collapsed. Friends ghosted her. The school extended her leave, and Jonathan stopped answering her calls. I'd severed them, left them drowning in the wreckage. And I wasn't done yet. The fallout from that email was like a wildfire I'd set and couldn't stop watching burn. Claire's life unraveled thread by thread, and I stood there, the quiet arsonist, pretending to help her douse the flames. Her phone rang off the hook. Her principal, her sister, old college friends, all demanding answers she couldn't give. She'd pace the living room, clutching her hair, muttering, "This can't be happening." I'd offer tea, a shoulder, hollow words of comfort, and she'd take them, too broken to see the lie in my eyes. Meanwhile, Jonathan's silence was a blade. She'd text him, call him, leave voicemails that went unanswered. He was a rat abandoning a sinking ship, and I savored it. I wasn't idle, though. The email had cracked her world, but I wanted it shattered. I knew her family, her parents especially, were her anchor. They lived an hour away, in a quaint little house full of photos and pride for their perfect daughter. I drove there one Saturday while Claire was at a lawyer's office, trying to salvage her job. Her mom, Ellen, answered the door, her face lined with worry. "Daniel, what's going on?" she asked, ushering me in. I sat on their floral couch, hands clasped, and spun a tale, half-truths laced with poison. I told them Claire had been distant, secretive, that I'd found strange receipts, late-night calls. I didn't mention Jonathan outright, just hinted, let their imaginations fill the gaps. "I'm worried she's not herself," I said, voice low. Her dad, Tom, clenched his jaw, and Ellen's eyes welled up. They didn't doubt me. I was the steady son-in-law, the one who fixed their car every spring. By the time I left, I'd planted a seed. 2 days later, Claire got a call from her mom, tearful, accusatory. "How could you do this to Daniel? To us?" Claire stormed into the kitchen, face red, screaming that I'd turned her family against her. "What did you say to them?" she demanded. I shrugged, said I'd just checked in, that they must have misunderstood. She didn't buy it, but she had no proof, and that doubt gnawed at her. Her parents stopped calling after that, and the silence hit her harder than any words could. Jonathan, meanwhile, was sinking fast. His condo sale fell through. Buyers spooked by the scandal, and his social media went dark. I kept tabs through my guy, the one I'd hired to tail him. He was drinking more, fighting with his firm, losing everything he'd built. I could have stopped there, let them limp along in their misery, but I was too far gone. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt, hollowed out, betrayed, stripped bare. So I turned to his past. My guy dug up an old fling. Some woman Jonathan had dated years back, dumped when she got too clingy. I found her online, sent a message from a burner account. "He's at it again. Same game, different girl." I included a photo of him and Claire, let her connect the dots. She took the bait, started posting about him, old stories of lies and broken promises, tagging his clients, his friends. The internet lit up, and Jonathan's name became mud. Claire saw it too, called me crying, saying, "He's not who I thought." I nodded, held her, and thought, "You're next." Claire was a shell now, moving through our house like a ghost. She'd lost her job, officially fired after the school board reviewed the evidence, and her family's rejection left her unmoored. She'd sit by the window, staring at nothing, her phone silent except for the occasional spam call. I'd catch her whispering to herself, piecing together how it all fell apart, but she never looked at me like I was the architect. Not yet. I kept up the act. Cooked dinner, asked about her day, played the husband she'd stopped deserving. It was almost too easy. Jonathan's collapse fueled me. My guy sent photos, him at a bar, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, arguing with the bartender over a tab he couldn't pay. His car got repossessed, his reputation torched beyond repair. I'd scroll through the chaos online, clients suing, old friends cutting ties, and feel a dark satisfaction. But Claire still mourned him, I could tell. She'd stare at his last text. "I'm sorry, I can't." Like it was a lifeline. That's when I decided to twist the knife deeper, to make her see him for what he was. I forged a letter. Took me hours to get the tone right. His arrogance, his charm, distilled onto paper. "Claire," it read, "you were a fun distraction, but I'm done. Found someone new, less baggage, less drama. Good luck." I printed it, weathered the edges, slipped it into an envelope with his initials. JP, scrawled on the front. I left it in her car, tucked under the seat where she'd find it eventually. She did 3 days later. Came into the house sobbing, clutching it, saying, "He never cared." I held her, stroked her hair, and let her break against me. Inside, I was grinning. Her despair was fuel, but I needed more. I needed her to feel trapped. I started messing with her head, subtle at first. Moved her keys, hid her favorite mug, turned off the Wi-Fi when she wasn't looking. She'd search the house, flustered, asking, "Am I losing it?" I'd shrug, say, "Maybe you're just stressed." Then I went bigger, changed her email password, locked her out of her accounts. She'd call tech support, frantic, and I'd watch her unravel, piece by piece. "Someone's doing this," she'd whisper, and I'd nod, all concern, while knowing it was me. Jonathan got a taste of it too. I sent an anonymous tip to the IRS, claimed he'd dodged taxes on his side hustle. Didn't matter if it stuck. The audit would bury him in paperwork and fear. My guy confirmed it. Jonathan was selling furniture online, desperate for cash. I'd taken his life apart, but Claire was the final act. I wanted her to beg, to crumble, to see no way out. The house felt like a pressure cooker, and I was turning up the heat. Claire barely slept. Dark circles carved hollows under her eyes, and her hands shook when she poured coffee. She'd stopped fighting the chaos, stopped asking questions, just drifted through the days like a leaf caught in a storm. I'd catch her staring at me sometimes, a flicker of suspicion in her gaze, but it'd fade into exhaustion. She didn't have the strength to accuse me, and that weakness was my canvas. I started leaving clues. Tiny, jagged pieces she couldn't ignore. A receipt from the diner, slipped into her coat pocket. A motel keycard, room 12, tucked into her purse. She'd find them, freeze, then shove them away like they burned. "Where did this come from?" she'd mutter, and I'd say, "No idea, babe." Casual as ever. Her mind was cracking, and I fed it. Whispered Jonathan's name in my sleep one night, watched her jolt awake, staring at me like I'd betrayed her secret. She didn't ask, just turned away, trembling. I'd planted doubt in every corner of her world. Her friends were gone, her family silent, but I wanted her isolated completely. I called her old coworkers, used a burner phone, faked a concerned parent's voice, said she'd been erratic, unstable, shouldn't be around kids. Word spread. The last few who'd pitted her pulled back. She'd check her messages, find nothing, and cry into her hands. "No one cares anymore," she said once, and I nodded, all sympathy, thinking good. Jonathan was a footnote now, holed up in a cheap apartment, dodging calls from lawyers and the taxman. I sent him a package, and signed, untraceable. Inside was a photo of him and Claire, the one from the bar, with "You ruined her" scrawled in red marker. My guy watched him open it, said he threw it across the room, then sat there, head in his hands, for hours. I liked that image. Him alone, crushed, knowing he'd lost. Claire's final unraveling came one night. I'd rigged the camera footage, looped a clip of her texting Jonathan, played it on my laptop where she'd see. She walked in, saw herself on the screen, and froze. What is this?" she stammered. I acted shocked, said, "Found it on my computer. Someone sent it." Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, sobbing, "They're everywhere." I knelt beside her, whispering, "We'll figure it out," while knowing she'd never escape the cage I'd built. Claire stopped functioning after that night. She wouldn't leave the house, said she felt eyes on her, voices in the walls. I'd nod, all concern, while tightening the screws. I'd leave the TV on static, Let it hiss through the night, watch her flinch at every crackle. She'd mutter about Jonathan, about the motel, about things she couldn't piece together, and I'd listen, feeding her paranoia with silence. She was a puppet now, strings tangled in my hands, and I was ready for the grand finale. I staged it carefully, took a day off work, said I had errands, left her alone. Before I went, I scattered more bait. His cologne on my jacket, a diner napkin on the counter, a scribbled note in my handwriting. Meet me tonight. She found them. I knew she would. Called me, voice shaking. Are you with him? I laughed, said, who? And hung up. When I got home, she was a wreck. Hair wild, eyes darting, clutching the note like it was proof. You know, she whispered. You've always known. I didn't answer, just watched her spiral. Jonathan got his own curtain call. I'd saved the best for him. His pride, his manhood, the last shred of who he'd been. I hired a woman, not my guy this time, someone discreet, to meet him at a bar. She flirted, got him drunk, took him to a hotel. I tipped off a local blogger, some sleazy type who loved a scandal. They caught him stumbling out, her arm around him, headlines screaming, disgraced realtor's new low. Claire saw it online, screamed, threw her phone, called him a liar through tears. I sat there, quiet, letting her drown in it. Her breaking point came that night. She grabbed a kitchen knife, not to hurt me, herself. I can't live like this, she sobbed, blade trembling against her wrist. I took it gently, held her, said, you don't have to. She collapsed into me, begging forgiveness. For what? She didn't say. I didn't care. I'd won. She was nothing now, a husk I'd hollowed out, and Jonathan was a wreck across town, oblivious to the puppet master pulling every string. But I wasn't done. I wanted one last act, something they'd carry forever. I started planning something permanent, something crueler than anything yet. They'd feel it together, even miles apart. Claire was a shadow of herself, clinging to me like I was her last anchor. Irony's a brutal thing. I'd torn her apart, and now she needed me to hold the pieces. She'd whisper apologies in the dark, for things she couldn't name, and I'd stroke her hair, promising it'd be okay. It wouldn't. Jonathan was a mess too. Evicted, living in a motel now, the same one they'd used. I liked that twist, the poetic sting of it. But I wasn't satisfied. I'd broken their lives, their minds, but I wanted a mark they couldn't erase. I started with Claire. She trusted me again, blindly, so I used it. Took her to a tattoo parlor one evening. Said it'd be a fresh start, something to reclaim herself. She nodded, numb. Let me pick the design. I chose his initials. JP, small, sharp, on her wrist where she'd see it every day. The artist inked it while she stared at the ceiling, too lost to question. When it was done, she touched it, confused, and I said, it's for you to remember who you are. She didn't argue, just cried quietly on the drive home. Every glance at it would be a wound, a reminder of him, of me, of what she'd lost. Jonathan's turn was trickier. He was paranoid now, jumping at shadows, but I found a way. My guy slipped into his motel room, drugged his beer, nothing lethal, just enough to knock him out. While he slept, we tattooed her name, Claire, across his chest, big and bold, impossible to hide. He woke up to it, I heard later, screamed, scrubbed at it till his skin bled, but it stayed. A mirror to her mark, a permanent tether to the woman he'd ruined me for. I leaked photos, hers to his old clients, his to her family. Anonymous, of course. The tattoos became their scarlet letters, a public brand of their shame. Claire's mom called once, voice cold. You're not my daughter anymore. Jonathan's last friend cut him off, said he was pathetic. They were alone, marked, and I watched it all from the sidelines, my hands clean. The final touch was subtle. I left a voicemail on Claire's phone, from a burner, mimicking Jonathan's voice. I'll never forgive you. She played it over and over, sobbing, while I cooked dinner like nothing happened. She didn't know I'd done the same to him. A message in her voice. You destroyed me. They'd carry that hate, that blame, forever. never knowing I'd orchestrated every note. The tattoos were my masterpiece, but they weren't the end. Just the frame for the picture I'd been painting. Claire wore her wrist like a shackle, tracing those initials. JP, with her thumb when she thought I wasn't looking. She'd flinch at mirrors, at her own reflection, and I'd catch her whispering his name in her sleep. Jonathan's mark was louder. My guy sent me a photo of him shirtless at the motel. Claire, scrawled across his chest in black ink, red and raw from his clawing at it. They were bound by those scars, a silent scream tying them together, and I was the artist who'd carved it all. I kept the pressure on Claire. She'd lost everything, job, family, friends, but I wanted her spirit gone too. I started leaving voicemails from unknown numbers, recordings I'd pieced together from old videos of her mom, her sister, stitched into cruel loops. "You're a disgrace. We're done with you." She'd listen, pale, then delete them, but they kept coming. I'd watch her jump at every ring, her hands trembling as she checked the screen. "Someone hates me," she'd say, and I'd nod, all soft concern, saying, "Maybe it's a prank." It wasn't. It was me, peeling away her last threads of hope. Jonathan got his own torment. I sent letters, typed no signature, detailing every moment I'd watched them. The diner, the motel, her blue dress swaying as she walked to his car. "I saw it all," they read. "You'll never outrun it." My guy dropped them in his mailbox, watched him tear them open, his face twisting as he read. He'd look around, wild-eyed, like I was hiding in the shadows. I wasn't, but he'd never know that. I wanted him haunted, jumping at every creak, every stranger's glance. At home, Claire clung to me harder, a drowning woman grasping driftwood. She'd cook dinner, her hands unsteady, and beg me not to leave. "You're all I have," she'd say, eyes wet. I'd smile, kiss her forehead, and think how easy it'd be to finish her off. But I didn't, not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight first, to carry it until it crushed her. The voicemails, the tattoo, the silence from her world, it was working. She'd stopped eating much, her clothes hanging loose, her voice a whisper. Jonathan was crumbling too. My guy said he'd quit the motel, move to a friend's couch, but even that wouldn't last. I'd made sure of it, spread rumors through fake accounts, called his buddy pretending to be a creditor. "He's a leech," I'd say. "Cut him loose." The friend did, and Jonathan was on the street, a bag of clothes and that tattoo his only company. I'd won, but the victory felt hollow. I needed one last push, something to seal their ruin forever. Claire's descent was a slow bleed, and I fed it daily. I'd leave the house for work, circle back, and watch her through the windows, curled on the couch, staring at nothing, her wrist a constant fidget. I'd rigged the TV to glitch, flashing static at odd hours, and she'd jump, muttering about signs. I'd planted a photo too, an old one of her and Jonathan, slipped into a book she loved. She found it one night, gasped, and tore it to pieces, sobbing, "Why won't it stop?" I came home late, found her rocking in the dark, and held her, whispering, "You're safe," while knowing she'd never be. Jonathan was a wreck. My guy tracked him to a shelter, unshaven, muttering to himself. I sent one last letter. "She blames you. Always will." He'd read it, I knew, and let it fester. But I wanted more. I wanted him to see her ruin, to feel it echo his own. So I staged a meeting, forged a note in her handwriting. "Meet me, diner, 8 p.m., and had my guy slip it under his door. Then I texted him from a burner, mimicking her. "I need to see you." He showed up. I watched from my truck, a block away. Claire didn't, of course. I'd locked her phone in my toolbox, left her pacing at home, clueless. He waited an hour, hunched in that booth, staring at the door. When he left, shoulders slumped, I followed him to a bridge, old, rusted, spanning a river that cut through town. He stood there, hands gripping the rail, and I wondered if he'd jump. He didn't, just stared into the water, broken. I drove home, satisfied. Claire was waiting, frantic. "Where's my phone?" I handed it back, said I'd found it in the garage, and watched her scroll through nothing, No messages, no hope. I upped the game. Took her car keys one night, hid them, then found them with a motel keychain attached. Room 12's logo glaring at her. She dropped it like it burned, stammering, "How?" I shrugged, said, "Maybe you forgot." She didn't sleep that night. Sat up, rocking, whispering his name. I lay beside her, eyes closed, plotting the end. Jonathan deserved a finale too, something to match her collapse. I'd tie them together one last time, a knot they'd never untangle. Her family was my next move. I called her mom, used a voice changer, posed as a concerned friend. "She's falling apart," I said. "Blames you for abandoning her." Ellen cried, hung up, and didn't reach out. Claire's last lifeline snapped, and I watched her sink deeper, a ghost in our house. Claire was barely human now. Skin pale, eyes sunken, a wraith drifting through rooms. She'd stopped asking questions, stopped fighting the chaos I'd woven. The motel keychain broke something in her. She'd hold it sometimes, staring, like it was a relic of a life she couldn't reclaim. I'd catch her muttering, "I didn't mean to," and I'd nod, all soft patience, while tightening the noose. She didn't eat unless I pressed her, didn't sleep unless I sat beside her, and I used that dependence like a weapon. Jonathan was a shadow too. My guy said he'd been picked up for loitering, released with nowhere to go. I sent him a package, unmarked, delivered to the shelter before he'd left. Inside was a mirror, small and cracked, with "Look at yourself" scratched into the frame. He'd see her name on his chest, I knew, and feel the weight. I wanted him to carry it, to choke on it, and he did. My guy saw him smash it, cut his hand, then sit there bleeding, staring at the shards. I brought Claire to the edge next. Took her for a drive to clear her head. Stopped at that same bridge where Jonathan had stood. She didn't know he'd been there. Just stared at the water, wind tugging her hair. "It'd be easy," she whispered, and I didn't answer, just watched her lean closer to the rail. I pulled her back, said, "Not yet," and drove her home. She didn't resist, just sat there, empty. I wanted her to choose it herself, to feel the pull and know I'd let her fall. Her last thread was Rusty, our dog. He'd nudge her, whine, and she'd pet him absently, a flicker of warmth in her haze. So I took him, left the back gate open one night, let him wander off. She woke up, called for him, searched the yard in a panic. "He's gone," she sobbed, and I hugged her, said, "He'll come back." Knowing he wouldn't, I dropped him at a shelter 2 towns over. She stopped talking after that, just sat by the door, waiting for nothing. Jonathan got his own push. I left a voicemail. Her voice, clipped from old recordings. "You did this to me." He'd hear it, I knew, and spiral. My guy confirmed it. Said he'd trashed his room, left town on foot, heading nowhere. They were both at the brink now, and I was ready to shove them over. Claire didn't leave the house anymore. Sat by that door, eyes fixed on the spot Rusty used to sleep. She'd stopped crying, stopped muttering, just stared. Her wrist tattoo a faint pulse under her sleeve. I'd cook, set a plate in front of her, and watch it go cold. "Eat," I'd say, and she'd nod, but her hands wouldn't move. She was a doll I'd wound down, springs broken, and I felt a strange pride in it. Jonathan was gone. My guy lost him after he'd hitched a ride out of town, a duffel over his shoulder, her name still inked into his skin. They were apart, but I'd make sure they fell together. I staged the end for Claire first. Wrote a letter, his handwriting this time, forged from old texts. "I'm done running. Meet me where it started." You know where. I left it on the counter, watched her find it. Her eyes lit up, a flicker of the old Claire, and she grabbed her coat, keys, muttering, "He's back." I didn't stop her, just followed, truck rumbling a block behind. She drove to the diner, parked, waited. He didn't show, of course. I'd sent him the same note, her words, "Meet me where it started." But he was miles away, clueless. She sat there an hour, hope draining, then drove to the bridge. I parked far off, watched her step out, lean over that rail again. The river churned below, dark and cold. And she stood there, swaying, the letter crumpled in her fist. I didn't move, just let her feel it, the weight of nothing left. She climbed the rail, slow, deliberate, and I thought, this is it. But she didn't jump. Sat there, legs dangling, staring down. I drove home, left her to it. She came back hours later, soaked from rain, silent. And I knew I'd pushed her as far as she'd go alone. Jonathan's end was Messier. I tracked him through a burner phone I'd slipped into his bag. Found him in a cheap motel 3 towns over. Sent a final package. A photo of Claire at the bridge, time-stamped, with "she's waiting" written on it. My guy watched him open it. Said he froze, then bolted, hitchhiking back. He'd get to the bridge, I knew, and find nothing but echoes. I wanted him chasing a ghost, running on fumes until he broke. Claire looked at me that night, eyes dead, and said, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded, said, "Yeah." And she curled up, a shell. I'd stripped her bare, her love, her life, her will, and left her with his initials and a void. Jonathan would stumble back, find the diner empty, the bridge silent, and know he'd lost her too. They'd live, maybe, but not really, not like before. The end came quiet, a whisper after all the noise. Claire stayed in bed now, blankets pulled tight, her wrist tattoo peeking out like a brand. She didn't speak, didn't eat, just breathed. Slow, shallow, like she was rationing air. I'd sit beside her, watch her chest rise and fall, and feel the weight of what I'd done. Not guilt, satisfaction, cold and sharp, like a blade I'd honed for months. Jonathan made it back. I saw it on the burner's GPS, a dot at the bridge, then the diner, then nowhere. My guy found him later, slumped in an alley, bottle in hand, her name a shadow on his chest. They were alive, but I'd killed them all the same. I left Claire a final gift. Slipped a recorder under her pillow, hours of her own voice, old snippets I'd saved. Laughing with him, whispering promises, stitched into a loop of betrayal. She'd wake to it, I knew, and hear herself forever. When I packed a bag that night, she didn't stir, just lay there, lost in the hum of her past. I walked out, locked the door, and drove off, the house shrinking in my rear view. She'd find the recorder eventually, and it'd be the last nail, pinning her to what she'd done. Jonathan got his too. I mailed him a key, room 12's, the real one this time, with a note. She's still there. He'd go, I was sure. Crawl back to that motel, unlock the door, find it empty, and feel the hole I'd carved in him. My guy confirmed it days later. Said he checked in, stayed, staring at walls like they talk back. They wouldn't. She wouldn't. I'd made sure of that. I moved an hour away, new town, new shop, new life. Rusty was with me. Picked him up from the shelter, let him ride shotgun. I'd fixed cars, built a home, loved a woman, and torn it all down with my own hands. Claire and Jonathan would carry their marks, their echoes, until time or despair took them. I didn't care which. I'd won. Not with fists or shouts, but with patience, with precision, with a revenge so deep it'd outlast them both. Sometimes I'd check online, her school site scrubbed her name, his real estate page gone. They were ghosts now, footnotes in a story I'd written. I'd sip coffee, pet Rusty, and feel the quiet. It wasn't joy, wasn't peace. Just the sound of a job finished, a debt paid. They'd betrayed me, built something behind my back, and I'd turned it into ash. That was enough.